Camera's rolling. So this is take 4. Tell me a little bit more about some of your early experiences of listening to your mom read the adults read the poetry. Do you remember any specific poems, or was there anything in the language that spoke to you?
In the early days when I was young, listening to the poetry, it was really about the rhythms. It was about the memory. And so imagine it being a young child laying on the floor of the living room. You're not only listening, but you're observing, and you're observing the happiness. Some of it was natural, some of it was substance induced, but they were having a good time. And collectively, you associate, whether it be poetry or the Doors' early music, with that good time, and so that plants a seed, right? That plants a seed that you carry forward in your own association with that music from that point in time. However, when you think of the Doors and you think about how their music has endured over generations, and it stayed fresh, and so it would come back to you when you were in college, right, and beyond college, and then in other points of your life, all the way until, the last few years when the doctor delivers the news that he did. And so that to me is something that, when I think about it, you think about how many things stay with you for a lifetime, and really fundamentally become the backdrop to your own story. And the Doors is just, and Jim Morrison has always been, one of those bands and one of those influences.
Great. Do you have maybe a favorite poem or a favorite song? Just one that you can say definitively, this is my favorite.
Yeah, I can, and I'll add to that. I'll talk a little bit about their music
Sure.
as well. So while he doesn't necessarily have a favorite poem, because a lot of his poems are actually they're not elaborate. Some of them are more like sound bites. They're like well constructed thoughts, and then they're done. And so you don't reminisce about a great thought for a long time. It's like, oh, okay, that was good, and move on. Their songs are really interesting in that several of their songs start to feel as though they're going to take on a different genre of music, like Soul Kitchen, right? For instance, you hear the start of that song and it has a really nice, rhythm and beat to it. You feel it, but then they have this way in some of their songs, is then all of a sudden they come together and they would chop it up in a hard beat, and it was almost like a wake up call, like stop just moving and dance to the song. Think about what we're saying. And to me, that was something that it's common in most of their songs that you feel like you might want to start dancing to. They'll change the rhythm, they'll change the beat, and they'll almost bring this militaristic marching, boom, 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 into it. And all of a sudden you get away from dance, and your focus goes back to the lyrics, which I think, so in some stages of my life, I really appreciated that. In some stages of my life, such as when I wanted to dance, I found it really annoying. But it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that tends to be a theme in a lot of their musical composition and construction. If I go back to a song that I love, well, it's hard to narrow down to one. But there's something about LA Woman and the themes, and even when your mind goes, and even though you could recite the lyrics to LA Woman, while you're listening to the song, I always go back, I vacillate back and forth, like, wait, is he talking about the city? Or is he talking about a woman? Oh, he's talking about the city. Wait, the way he just sang driving down your freeway, it sounds like a woman. And that's the beauty of a lot of the songs, right? The varied meaning, the meaning that you take and you interpret for yourself. And so, but I think, when I think LA Woman, Break On Through, Soul Kitchen, Crystal Ship, some of these would certainly top my list of my favorite songs.
Terrific. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd want to say about Jim Morrison or the Doors? Other memories?
No, the only thing that, like, when Alex contacted me for this, one of the reasons I agreed to do it is the one thing I told you about the end, when I had my cancer diagnosis, which, by the way, yesterday, part of the reason we did it today, I was up at Mayo Clinic. They do a retest every 2 years, so I'm now 2 years in remission, knock wood. But to me, that was the most powerful, it brought to my consciousness how important the Doors were when I'm getting the worst news of my life, or potentially the worst. When you hear lymphoma, we know what it means out there, but until you're diagnosed with something, all of a sudden you realize how little you know about most things compared to what you want to know. And so, to me, that was probably the most powerful. That's when the importance of the Doors came into my consciousness. That I'm getting the worst news of my life, and the end, and Jim Morrison is singing to me, and I'm transposing this as I'm looking at the physician and at my wife. And I'm like, get this song out of my head. I don't want it to be the end, right? I want to break on through to the other side. I want to do anything else except this be the end. And the song got louder and louder. And it was a very profound moment for me. So I think that to me cemented what has really been the lifetime and a backdrop in the subconscious of what the Doors are.
Amazing. Sound is rolling, speeding, camera is rolling. Okay, so how did Jim Morrison get into your life?
Jim Morrison came into my life when I was a young child. So I was born in '67. I was raised in a single parent house with my mother. It was the two of us. And my mom, as a nurse, by evening, usually on the weekends, would have her parties, her friends over, her gathering. And part of what young parents would do, she was all of 18 to 20 in the late 60s, early 70s, is they'd come in, they would party, and they would also read poetry. And so the first I heard of Jim Morrison was as Jim Morrison, the poet. So we had Whitman, Eliot, Keats, Morrison. And it wasn't until I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 years old that I made the connection that he was also the lead singer for the Doors. So unlike the rest of the world who knew Jim Morrison as a singer and then learned about his other artistic flair, I knew him first as a poet who I thought made the transition to becoming the lead singer of a rock star. And I thought, well, how cool is that? And that's how Jim Morrison first came into my world.
Fantastic. Cool. Let me do one more. Sound speeding, cameras rolling. We'll call this actual take one, if I can avoid kicking the camera. Okay, great. So how did Jim Morrison come into your life?
Jim Morrison came into my life when I was a young boy, probably 3 to 4 years old in the late 60s, early 70s. I was raised as an only child by my mother, and with herself being 18, 19, 20 years old in the late 60s, we didn't watch much television at all, but we always listened to music. And part of that, she had friends and she would entertain often, and they would read poetry. And with all the great poets of Keats and Walt Whitman and Eliot, there was also Jim Morrison. And it wasn't until I was a few years older that I made the connection that Jim Morrison was also the lead singer of the Doors. And whereas most people got to know Jim Morrison, as being a rock star and a lead singer first, I thought he was a poet who made a pretty interesting transition to become a leading singer of a band. And that's how he really came into my world.
Great. Speeding, Camera is rolling. Take two. How did Jim Morrison get into your life?
Jim Morrison came into my life when I was a young child, 3, 4, 5 years old. This is the late 60s, early 70s. My mom wasn't much older than me. She was 18, 19 at that time. And she would entertain quite a bit. And with that, in our house, they would listen to music and they would read poetry. We really didn't watch TV. And so while they read about the greats, I thought great poets were Whitman, Keats, Eliot, Morrison. It wasn't until a few years later that I connected the dots that Jim Morrison, the poet, was also the lead singer of The Doors. And I thought, wow, how fantastic. A poet becomes a rock singer. And whereas most of the world knew him as the rock legend, who also happened to write poetry and to make film. And so he came into my world as a pretty interesting poet before I knew him as a singer.
Fantastic. Great. So don't mind if I'm ever looking in here, but you're doing perfect. We'll take just about a few seconds in between questions to make sure that we can cut and everything, but let's keep going. So what part of Jim's art really got to you?
Well, I loved his way of provoking thought and making you see things through a different lens. The music was obviously moving, but the more you learned about him and his background, one of the more interesting mediums that he preferred was the interview, which is exactly what I do for a living now. And he liked it because he thought an interview was one of the most existential exchanges that two humans could have. Because once you answered a question, you could never pull it back in. You could edit it, but it was out there for all to hear. And fundamentally, what we do, and what I do in our firm and in my profession, is interviewing people. And I remember having those early seeds before I knew what a recruiter was or what someone was as a headhunter. But I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. There was something about even that philosophy that inspired me to learn more, and to learn more about the thoughts and beliefs and the questions. And he was a person of lots of internal tension and a juxtaposition about him. He was a rock star, but he had a bit of a disdain for the spectator and the fan. And so it was always this where he was a thinking man's musician, really.
Fantastic. Okay, so we'll keep going. How did Jim's music or poetry help you in your personal life? You may have answered that a little bit, but maybe something in personal, less professional.
Yeah. So his music and poetry, it wasn't only an early influence and beginning, but it comes back. It's cyclical. It comes back into my world. And so I remember when I was very young, hearing one of his interviews where he talked about the most critical person in the future of our society is going to be the connector. It wasn't the person you worship. It wasn't the rock star. It was going to be the connector, the person that brings people together. And that, plus his favorite medium as being the interview, really helped drive me and form a view of what I wanted to do, right, professionally. When I talk about it coming back cyclically, about 3 years ago, I had a small biopsy, and the doctor came in with my wife by my side. And this is the same doctor who told me, nothing to worry about, I didn't see anything that should be alarming. Fast forward 3 days, he comes in to my hospital room, and he said, we've just diagnosed you with lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He goes, the good news is it's not necessarily terminal. However, as you hear the doctor utter the words that you have cancer, and I'm looking at my wife, and all these emotions flood in, be damned. The beginning of the Doors song, The End, starts playing in my head. And it starts building up. And so my wife's asking about what do we do for treatment. and he's explaining it, but I can hardly hear the doctor because I'm hearing, "This is the end. This is the, I'll look into your eyes one more time," and I'm like, oh my God. So I don't know if I'm feeling more emotional because of hearing the song "The End" and looking at my wife, or dealing with the fact that I now have lymphoma and I have to sort out what that means to treat that. And so every now and again you can have life moments, and for any music that you appreciate or person that has made you think, they'll come back to you, as an example.
That's amazing. Um, so, did Jim Morrison inspire you, and how did he actually inspire you?
So to talk about Jim Morrison as inspiring me, at the same time I appreciate that Jim Morrison would have a disdain for that. Um, but Jim Morrison is among the many people who have inspired me. He's inspired me because he's not about the conformist, and I've never been a conformist. Jim Morrison is about, how do you give back? How do you do your thing? He didn't look to be famous. In fact, if he had it to do all over again, it's well documented, he probably would have toiled away in his backyard as a private little artist and not have been so demonstrative. And so Jim Morrison inspired me because he was really okay with the imperfect form. And so as I've gone through life and I've failed, I've had setbacks, I've made mistakes, as we all do, I've never dwelled on those. In fact, I've learned to embrace being an imperfect form, but just continuing to go forward, move on, try your best. And to me, that was always a very profound guiding principle for a way to navigate life, as both a professional, as a father, as a husband, as a friend, as a family member.
Cool. Great. So we'll keep going. So for you, do you notice a difference between listening to The Doors or listening to another music band or another rock band?
Yeah. So I always thought I've noticed the difference between listening to The Doors in a different band. They had a different sense when they came together. The rhythms, the way that it wasn't just an overlay between the musicians. They would have an overlay as they started their songs, and then they'd come back together, unified beats, right? So that was always very unique to them. Their sound was unique. There wasn't another band that sounded just like them. So I thought, well, maybe that was me, because The Doors and Jim Morrison, they'd influenced at different pivot points in my life. But I've recently tested this with my now 7-year-old son. I have 4 boys, my youngest is 7. And he plays the drums, he plays the guitar, he considers himself a modern day musician at 7. But he's taken by The Doors, without context, right? So we're convinced he is an old soul, but to hear a 7-year-old and to see his face the first time I played Break On Through, right? And to watch him when I crank Hello, I Love You as we're on the way to his hockey game, and now that becomes his motivation. He wants that as his warm-up song. He listens to The Doors to help get him pumped for a game. So there has to be something unique about it, although I can't articulate exactly what that is.
Do you think that it might have to be something with their instrumental makeup? I think that they were one of the few rock bands in the 60s and 70s that were mostly just guitar, drums, keyboard, vocals. It didn't have really a bass. There's almost maybe something classical to the keyboard. Is there something specific in the music?
Well, yeah. So you have these forces coming together, where you have the spoken word, now infused into a song. If you listen to most of their songs, it sounds like, poetry. They could have been spoken, and it would have been a great poem. Instead, they made it into a song. But then, when you bring Robbie and Ray and the rest of the band together, it's like a coming together of great musicians, right? That each had their own sounds, but more than that, they had this way of just, that they could play off each other's energy. And there was really good karma whenever they came together and were in a studio and or on stage, right? In the early years especially. And you know, a lot of bands can bring together great musicians, but they don't have that kind of chemistry and connection and energy that brings it all together. And I think it's because, in a large part, when they came together, when they formed, they had a very singular focus with what they wanted to do before it became tainted by fame, before it became tainted by substances that derailed a lot of their efforts at the time. But you know, in those formative times around the band, they did some phenomenal work, and I think a lot of us wish we could capture that in a bottle, right, and have it today.
So you might have touched on this a little bit, but would you say that the music or the poetry of Jim Morrison sort of fits you best or speaks to you most? Would you say that more the music or more the poetry?
It's a great question. Even, you know, it's funny. So I'm thinking about different phases of understanding his poetry. So when I was, you know, 4, 5, 6, it didn't mean anything to me. I liked the rhythms of it. And the same could be said for the songs at that age. Like, it moved you. You didn't think about it. It was just, wow, that's a really good rhythm. And as you age, I think some of the poetry, it says more about the man and the author. It says more about a tortured and troubled soul. And so it brings forth not a sense of, oh, that inspires me as a person, but it makes you almost feel a sense of compassion for the author. And it brings forth a sense of melancholy, because how can you not help think but what may have been, right? If there was different guidance or motivation at that point in time. But the music endures. And the music, you can listen to the Doors music today and not have a sense of melancholy, and not have a sense of, you could just enjoy it in the moment as though it was just being produced now. And so the poetry and music came together. After, you know, life and time goes on, there's divergent forces. Music endures, and you remain in a place with the man and thinking about that person, right, who's long since passed.
Cool. Okay, great. Camera's rolling. Okay, this is take 3. So you spoke a little bit earlier about you knew Jim Morrison was a poet before you knew he was a lead singer of the Doors. But maybe tell us about the early experiences of actually reading his poetry.
Yeah. So I would be laying on the living room floor with, I remember, green shag carpeting, and adults sitting around with the waft of smoke in the air, and usually the Doors and other bands of that era playing in the backdrop as they would read poetry. Mainly Jim Morrison poetry, right? And I'm sure there was other substances involved, not with me as a young child, but that was kind of enlightening, right, the room and the occupants of it. And for me, it really came down to feeling kind of the rhythms and understanding some of the words, but not all the words. But even as a young child, thinking, wow, this person is in the now, he's very present. It was about the reflection of the reality around us, where a lot of, he brought a lot of thoughts into the consciousness that were really subconscious for, I think, a lot of us. And even as a young child, although I didn't know the word was, you know, emerging from my subconscious or things becoming conscious, I thought, wow, this is an author talking about things that most people don't think of. This is a person who has a bit of a tension in their soul. This is a person who has a bit of a torment, but yet a lot of curiosity about the world and the world around him. And I thought it was amazing how he could be so thoughtful, so clued in to the things that most of us might just pass by, but he'd take notice. And those were the things I remember about his poetry when I was young.
Cool. Did his art influence your way of thinking, or specifically the way you see life? I think you've talked about some melancholy stuff, but is there anything that maybe his art taught you in something that you do daily?
Yeah. So there's quite a few things that his art taught and informed, and I'm always mindful of. So it starts with, what was the intention? His intention wasn't to become a lead singer. His intention wasn't to become a rock star. His intention was to become a filmmaker. And so the lesson in that is don't be overly prescriptive in your own world, in your own life. Let things come towards you and accept them as they are, and follow that, and follow it with great gusto, and look at the blessings that are before you and embrace them, as opposed to always following what you believe is your predetermined path. And Jim Morrison, if you follow his interviews, if you follow his, certainly the music, and the backdrop to it, you'd see, the Doors were never intended to be. The Doors just happened. And to me, a lot of life, that's exactly what's happened in my life. Most of it has just happened. It wasn't strategic. It certainly wasn't planned. And it was accepting things as they come and being certain that you're really comfortable with imperfect form and imperfection, and embracing your mistakes just as you would embrace your success, and treating both of those as gifts, and never becoming defeated by the latter. And to me, that was something that I think was always right there and present, for anyone who paid attention to what Jim Morrison would talk about, what he wrote about. And fortunately for me, I don't know that my soul was ever as troubled as his. And I chalk that up in some cases to just the sense of ignorance, which has allowed for a greater sense of bliss, which is okay.
Very, very true. So what do you think is so special about Jim Morrison's energy specifically? He definitely had an onstage persona, something that was a little rebellious. What do you think was so special that still speaks to people, even though it's been decades since his death?
I think there's complementary and competing characteristics that make Jim Morrison's energy so compelling, and what has folks like us talking about him decades after his death. And that is, there was a part of him that would like certain things that were said about him. He loved being called the Lizard King. He loved the admiration. Yet, if he had it to do all over again, he wouldn't be as demonstrative. He had a disdain for the spectator, but yet he had energy from the spectator. And I think when you bring all this together, if you were a rational person and solely objective, you'd say, well, it makes no sense as to why people harnessed anything of benefit or were ever inspired by him. However, what he was to a lot of people is he was incredibly authentic to who he was in all of its imperfections. He was one who spent the time to articulate what he was being. His energy was that of his spirituality. People would try and peg him down and say, what do you believe, right? And how does anyone answer that question? But what he exuded is a sense of energy and spirituality, that it wasn't about him. It was about this wonderful, incredible universe. And if you read his poetry, his published works, if you listen to his interviews, there's some interesting metaphor in there, in that in a certain set of interviews, he would describe being scared to death of snakes. but he was fascinated by it. He was fascinated by their beauty, but he was scared of them. In other interviews, he talked about how he viewed the universe as a mammoth snake, and the people and buildings and situations are nothing but scales on the snake, right? And so here's a person that really laid it out for us. He was terrified of the universe, but he appreciated its beauty. And I think part of that tension and conflict has people curious, fascinated. You may not admire him, you may not love the music, but it's pretty intriguing. And I think what made it all that more intriguing is that, he passed way too soon. And so if he was around us today, in his 80s or 90s, would we be as intrigued? No, because probably over several more decades, we would have understood more to the story. He would have had more time to articulate what he was thinking and knew then. But, myself sitting at 50, I have a much better ability to articulate what I'm about now than I could have when I was 26 years old, right? So I'm sure he would have achieved that. So part of that is his passing and that flash of Jim Morrison. And because he wasn't fully understood, has a lot of people intrigued still.
That's great. So what story or event do you like most from the Jim Morrison or Doors history? Is there a personal tale that you've heard that you're really fond of?
God, how do you boil that down? So there's so many the themes that come together. So there's everything from how some of their songs were made, like even if there were certain beats or rhythms going on in another one. So there's like those anecdotal stories. I think, oh, that's really just how music's made is always really interesting to me. And then there's more the tragic side, when which was well documented in film, when he kind of just unwound in front of an audience and all that. I mean, that was really sad. It was tragic. But it's like, it's hard to pin. Like for me, it's really difficult to pinpoint moments in time to say, wow, that's interesting. To me, the fascination comes through the collection of the stories, right? Through the collection of the episodes, and that's to me where it really starts to bring dimension. So I can think more about that for you, but that's a tough one. I saw that question on there, and that was the one. I'm like, there were two questions I had a tough time with. One is I've never been to the place of his birth or to where he lived, but nor would I have an interest, and nor would he have an interest in us going there, right? So not that I knew him, and that was the other one. Like, was there a moment, right?
Are there any pieces of footage that you've seen of the live performances or any of the films that he's done that are just your favorites? Something that one piece of art in particular that is.
So whenever I, in my mind's eye, think of the Doors, I think of them recording in their beachside, little studio that they would meet up in. And to me, that was about, something that was fresh, it was new, lots of creativity. It was before substance has taken over. It was before fame kind of made its impact, for good or bad, into the organization. And it was just very pure. It was very raw. And seeing early genius in that creative early stages is just very powerful. And so whenever I think of the Doors today, I don't think about them on stage in front of thousands of fans. I think of them in their beachside bungalow, laughing, smiling, creating.
Great. All right.